A week after the execution, Charles II was proclaimed king in Scotland. But Charles I's 18-year-old son wasn't there. He was in the Netherlands. He'd fled to France with a group of supporters 4 years earlier, and his one brief attempt to provide military help to his father in the Second Civil War had been a failure. His object now was to find a way of recovering his father's throne, and to hell with that stuff about being an absolute monarch. He landed in Scotland in 1651 and was prepared to sign up to whatever was asked of him, including agreeing to his father's blood guilt and his mother's idolatry, and becoming Presbyterian. If that's what it took to be proclaimed king, do it. The new English Republic wasn't going to stand for this, of course. The army, commanded by Cromwell, took over Scotland. Charles's forces were finally defeated at Worcester. If he'd been caught, he would probably have been killed. The story of his escape, disguised as a Worcestershire yokel, became a famous legend. At one point he spent all day hiding with a companion in an oak tree while the Roundheads searched for him below. It became a celebrated story in a way that didn't bode well for the Republic. Charles looked dashing and daring, while the Roundheads looked ridiculous, incompetent and heavy-handed. Throughout his 6 weeks' flight he remained cheery, polite and very resourceful, ending up in the George Inn at Brighton. It's interesting that none of the 3 or 4 dozen people who recognized him were moved to betray him, either by the potential death penalty they faced or the £1,000 reward they could collect. He got away to France, then to Germany and Brussels, living in a kind of limbo, short of money and with no coherent plan of return. So how did he do it? After the execution of Charles I, England was a republic. Look at what happened to the design of the Great Seal, the official mark on statutes and proclamations. Here's Charles's seal, the seal of a king. He canters on horseback with his greyhound running alongside, and the Latin motto means Charles, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France and Scotland, defender of the faith. After his execution, the new republic was in theory ruled by the House of Commons, so instead of a king's seal, the Great Seal was the seal of the House of Commons. It shows the Commonwealth, a map of Britain, and on the other side are the Commons themselves. And the motto simply says, 1651, in the 3rd year of freedom by God's blessing restored. In English. Didn't last, though, because the real power wasn't the House of Commons. It was the army. For a while, the army was too busy to take much notice of England. It was occupied with the destruction of Ireland, where a large part of the population were irredeemably loyal to Catholicism and the monarchy. But when it finally turned round and looked at England, it found that there still hadn't been a thoroughgoing Puritan revolution. So, in 1653, Cromwell, the army's most powerful general, cleared the Commons at sword point and installed a new parliament, which he thought would be more capable of bringing about a revolutionary transformation of society. His own Chamber of Righteous Puritans, the so-called nominated parliament, turned out to be no more to his liking, and he dismissed that too, installing himself as the Lord Protector. And the Great Seal was now his own. It shows Oliver Cromwell on horseback, just like Charles, but stepping out very stately rather than cantering with a greyhound. And the motto says,
"By the grace of God, the Republic of England, Scotland and Ireland, and the Protector Oliver,"
in Latin. In what sense was this a republic? However unwillingly, and he kept protesting his unwillingness, Cromwell was driven by his own belief in the divine right of revolution to run the country as a militarized kingdom for Puritan saints. There were now 11 districts, each run not by the people, but by major generals. These military ayatollahs collected taxes, ran the courts, and controlled public morality. Theatres were closed along with brothels and gambling dens. Horse racing and cockfights were banned. Everyone had to go to church, stay sober and morally upright. Pagan festivities, like Christmas, were banned, mince pies were forbidden. Oh, it must have been great. In 1656, a newly elected Parliament made it clear they wanted to return to the old constitution. They reopened the House of Lords and offered Cromwell the title of king. He seriously considered it. And although he turned it down, perhaps because the army would have turned against him, 2 years later, on his deathbed, he nominated his eldest surviving son as his successor, like any other king. Very few people cheered Lord Protector Richard Cromwell. Who was he? Not crowned, not acclaimed, not the leader of an army. People called him Tumble-Down Dick, and that's pretty much what happened. Early in 1660, one of his father's commanders, General Monk, seized London and summoned a special parliament to invite Charles II to return to the throne. If you're going to have a king, it might as well be one with the right credentials. Tumble-Down Dick became a private citizen. He changed his name and became a lodger in Cheshire. 30 years later, he wrote to his daughter that his safety was to be retired, quiet, and silent. He would have made a good constitutional monarch. But while the English may not have been quite sure what they did want, they now knew exactly what they didn't want. Anything run by soldiers or Puritans. No matter what else would happen in the world, England would never again let a military man have any political power. And a deep and abiding suspicion had been created of anyone who looks like a revolutionary or a religious enthusiast. Actually, this explains a lot about English history. Most countries were at some time in the last 300 years infected by revolutionary fervour or ideological passion, but England, it seems, has been vaccinated. It's been pretty much immune to political feverishness. Still is, I think. Charles was really a very popular king. His manner was light and easy, his court dissolute and cheerful, his sexual enthusiasms generous and very, very un-Puritan. As those great historians Sellers and Yeatman put it in 1066 and all that, not so much a king, more a monarch. The years since his father's execution were called the interregnum, and the idea was to pretend that nothing much had really happened. The parliamentary records for those years were torn up. An Act of Parliament gave the new king control of the armed forces, and Parliament agreed to give him an inadequate annual revenue. 10 of the people who'd been involved in the execution and trial of Charles I were themselves put on trial, and then hanged, drawn and quartered. Cromwell and 3 other military commanders of the parliamentary army were also put on trial. They didn't put up a very convincing defence, being dead. Their bodies were dug up and hung in chains at Tyburn. It was all good popular entertainment, and theatres reopened and maypoles were back in business. Merry England had been restored. Charles had given a written promise of pardons, arrears of army pay, and what was called liberty of tender consciences in religious matters. He also confirmed land purchases made during the interregnum, which helped maintain stability, but was a bit of a blow to cavaliers who'd lost their wealth and their land by being on the wrong side. In a way, the sense of a new beginning was strengthened by the destruction of the capital by plague and fire. Plague was a swift and grotesque disease, which had erupted frequently before, but in 1665 it took a firm grip and killed about 20% of the city's population. London was largely turned into a ghost city as the survivors fled. The king, who'd moved to Hampton Court, gave £1,000 a week to London charity. And then London began to burn. The king returned to the city with his brother James, the Duke of York, to take personal charge of firefighting in the streets. Everyone knew that the mayor had been too timid to pull down houses that might have created fire breaks until he was directly ordered to do so by Charles. It certainly helped the royal image, though it didn't help London much. The old, rotting, diseased structure was purified by an inferno that simply burned the place away as thoroughly as if it had been blasted by a nuclear weapon, and a lot more cleanly. And the new city that arose was a classic image of the political settlement of the restored monarchy. The old medieval structures had gone, but Christopher Wren's plan for a brand new city of piazzas and arcades was rejected. That was the sort of Renaissance princely city that existed on the continent. They were the stages on which state ceremonies could be impressively performed by grand leaders, not needed here. Wren was allowed to build a new modern cathedral and a swathe of churches in which altar, pulpit and congregation are positioned to be equally important, not too Roman Catholic, not too Puritan. But the old street plan was retained. Everyone could rebuild their own place on their own plot, and the narrow streets and little alleys of medieval London that still existed in everyone's memories regrew from the ashes. Even now, neither German bombs nor modern developers have quite destroyed them. There mustn't be another fire. Laws would insist on flat fronts, no overhangs, more brick. But the old city that had no overall plan, not even a basic map, reappeared with modern improvements designed not for a new life, but for a better continuation of the old one. Exactly. There was a general desire to better continue things as they had once been, rather than invent something new, or imitate something foreign. There was one other marker in the rebuilt London that showed what kind of country this now was. This fine column. It marks the site where the fire had begun. It shows the destruction of the city. There's Charles surrounded by liberty, genius and science, giving directions for its restoration. And there was originally an inscription explaining that the fire had been deliberately begun by papists.
In order to the carrying on their horrid plot for extirpating the Protestant religion and our English liberty, and the introducing popery and slavery.
It was nonsense, but a French watchmaker was hanged for his part in the non-existent plot. Robert Hubert. He wasn't in London when it happened. There was a pathological fear of papists. Awkward. Charles had a pension from the King of France given when he'd promised to convert to Roman Catholicism. The trick to being a king in this situation was, Charles understood very well, not to say exactly what his job was. There was a parliament, and it was beginning to form parties, one pro-monarch, one anti. But Parliament didn't actually rule the country. That was done by the king's ministers, a kind of cabinet government, referred to as a cabal, which meant that Charles wasn't seen as entirely responsible for things going wrong, which they quite often did. The Earl of Rochester wrote a mock epitaph on Charles's bedchamber door. Here lies our sovereign lord the king, whose words no man relies on, who never said a foolish thing, nor ever did a wise one. Charles saw it next morning and said, "Quite right. My words are my own, but my acts are the acts of my ministers." Charles died in 1685, 54 years old. On his deathbed, he converted to Roman Catholicism. He had no legitimate child left alive. The next in line to the throne was his brother James, who was already a Roman Catholic. This really wasn't going. James II was only 3 years younger than Charles II. He was the oldest man ever to have succeeded to the throne. To start with, nothing much seemed to have changed. Both brothers had led quite similar lives. Both were enthusiastic womanizers. Both seemed reasonably pragmatic. But the way James handled his first big crisis began to create alarm. The restoration of the monarchy had obviously not been welcomed by everyone. In the southwest especially, Puritan religious feeling remained strong and suspicious, especially with a Roman Catholic king. Charles II had an illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth, who was a Protestant. Rumours began to spread that he was actually legitimate, the true heir to the throne. Monmouth came over from the Low Countries and began a rising in the southwest, where he was proclaimed King Monmouth. The rebellion was crushed. James, determined to make an example of the rebels, ordered the arrest and punishment of everyone involved. At each centre, Dorchester, Taunton, Exeter, Bristol, Wells, people were rounded up for a special court known as the Bloody Assize, punishing not just rebels, but anyone who was accused of even helping the wounded. Around 230 people were executed, some hanged, drawn and quartered, and about 850 were sent to labour in the West Indies for 10 years. And many more, of course, were fined and had property confiscated. And James did not disband the army that had been formed to put down the rebels. England had a standing army again, just as it had under Cromwell. And he appointed Roman Catholic officers to run it. People began to murmur, and when the House of Lords expressed discontent, he dissolved Parliament. And as he continued to appoint Roman Catholics to public and church offices, public support began to ebb away from him. At his instigation, for instance, all the fellows of Magdalen College, Oxford, were dismissed, and the college was turned into a Catholic seminary. James had 2 daughters, who were both Protestants. The elder girl, Mary, was married to William of Orange, ruler of the Dutch, a Protestant head of state. The heir to the throne would reverse James's whole policy. But early in 1688, James's queen gave birth to a son who would be raised as a Catholic. This was, he thought, excellent news. It made him more secure. He was wrong. It sealed his fate. Well, that and the fact that he seemed to be preparing for a joint war with Catholic France against the Protestant Dutch. And now it became evident that the Civil War really had changed the place of the king in England. He ruled by permission of Parliament, and Parliament wasn't going to put up with this one. A group of leading members of Parliament sent a secret invitation to William of Orange to save the country from a Catholic takeover by bringing them military assistance. William brought over a fleet carrying a large professional army. James tried to block it with his own fleet, but the winds were against him, and William landed unopposed in November 1688 at Tor Bay. The West Country had its own score to settle with James. And James simply panicked. The army wasn't behind him. Parliament wasn't. London wasn't. He was going the same way as Tumbledown Dick. In the middle of the night, he scurried out of Whitehall Palace by a secret passage. He got down to Sheerness, throwing the Great Seal into the Thames on the way. Ha! That'll fox him! It didn't fox anyone. He was captured by local fishermen. Eventually, William gave him permission to go to France, and no one had the faintest idea what to do next. William hadn't come to depose James, but to give military backing to Parliament in their quarrel with him. James had quite obviously quit, abdicated, gone, taking his son with him. England, having failed to be a republic, had failed to be a monarchy. It was a bit of a puzzler. Perhaps William should declare himself king by right of conquest. He didn't think so. Parliament wanted Mary to take the crown, James's daughter, after all. But she insisted that her husband was boss, and he didn't intend to play the Duke of Edinburgh role, 2 paces behind the ruling lady. This short, stooping, asthmatic man with bad teeth was tough and shrewd. He was himself a grandson of Charles I, and wouldn't make a humble consort. In the end, a deal was struck. They would both be sovereigns, Mr. and Mrs. King and Queen, by the invitation of Parliament. And they had to sign up to some basic rules. No standing army unless Parliament agreed to it. No raising of money without Parliament's approval. No royal power to lay down the law. The King and Queen couldn't appoint or punish judges. They couldn't make war without Parliament's consent, and Parliament would decide who could have the crown. And it wouldn't be a Roman Catholic. All the questions posed by the Civil War were finally answered, and it was called the Glorious Revolution, because in the end, the whole basis of royal power was redefined without anyone being killed at all. Except in Ireland, of course. James, with French backing, decided to make a comeback through Ireland. It was, after all, one part of Britain where a Catholic king could expect some enthusiasm. Protestant settlers had been brought into Ulster, and they held Londonderry and Enniskillen against the Catholic regiments. Eventually, in 1690, there was a showdown between William's Anglo-Dutch-Danish army and James's Franco-Irish one at the River Boyne. James was beaten in a battle which has cast a grotesquely long shadow over Ulster. The annual celebration there of the Protestant victory has never lost its 17th century passion. The irony is that this was not a religious war at all. It was a war to contain the ambitions of France, and the Pope was actually firmly on the side of William of Orange. The Vatican was more anti-French than it was anti-Protestant. The Orange men at the Battle of the Boyne were actually fighting for the Pope as well as King Billy. And Billy, of course, was not exactly English. His native tongue was Dutch. William, a serious man, ended up spending much of his time on the continent, so in effect Mary did become the sovereign of England. But at the end of 1694, she died of smallpox. England was now in effect ruled by an oligarchy through Parliament. The king had a role, but by no means a commanding one. Part of that role, as he saw it, was to push forward religious tolerance in a fundamentally intolerant country. Tolerance does have its limits. At his death in 1702, the question of the succession had already been agreed and settled. The crown passed to Mary's sister Anne. Anne was married, as Mary had been, to a foreign prince, but her husband, Prince George of Denmark, was no William of Orange. He was a lazy alcoholic, and while Anne was willing to let him be naturalized as an Englishman and notional head of the army and navy, she was queen and he was a subject. No married queen had ever ruled alone before Anne, and she played it very regally. She was very keen on the ceremonial and quasi-magical position of royalty, holding ceremonies where she touched people with scrofula, swollen neck glands from tuberculosis. It was called the king's evil, and the power to cure it was supposedly the magical sign of true royalty. She was the last monarch to try it. Kings had male favourites, Anne had female favourites. The first and closest was Sarah Churchill, the wife of the Duke of Marlborough. They called each other by pet names. The Queen was Mrs. Freeman. Sarah was Mrs. Morley. Mrs. Morley's husband was England's leading military commander and the architect of a stunning victory at the Battle of Blenheim that placed England in a dominant position in Europe. But England's Queen did not decide who to fight or when to fight or how to fight. Politics was no longer really her business. Even when in 1707 England and Scotland were formally and permanently united by the Act of Union, it was not Anne's doing, but Parliament's. Anne did, it was true, refuse to sign one Act of Parliament at around that time, but it was a very minor technical issue, not a real challenge to the power of the politicians. Her life was spent more playing cards, chatting, being ill, and having 19 pregnancies. These pregnancies were watched with fascination by an elderly lady in Hanover, Sophia, the Electress Duchess of Brunswick-Lüneburg. She was James I's granddaughter, and because there were so few Protestants of the blood royal left alive, she was, by Act of Parliament, next in line to the throne, if Anne died childless, and if she lived long enough. One by one, Anne's pregnancies came and went. 14 miscarriages and stillbirths, 5 live births, but by the time Anne was widowed in 1708, all of them were dead. Sophia, aged 78, now just had to outlive the 43-year-old Anne to become Queen of England. Anne was a sick woman. Sophia was tough as an old boot. She knew she could do it. But in 1714, Sophia received an outrageous letter from Anne. Anne had somehow got the impression that Sophia was going to secretly send her son George to England in some kind of plot, and she told Sophia that would not be allowed. Sophia, now 84, was shocked, and the shock killed her, just 9 weeks before Queen Anne died. Sophia had failed, but her son George would now be king. In theory, a very weak constitutional monarch, but that hardly explains why 65 years later Englishmen launched a new war against royal tyranny and thousands were killed. England's royalty hadn't exactly packed up and disappeared, but the story of what they had done will have to wait for the next episode.
Lust and madness loom large in the colourful reigns of the Georgians tonight at 10 o'clock. And to do a quick historical quiz about the Stuarts, Sky Digital viewers press red. Hardware coming up on UK TV history, the Hawker Hurricane and the aircraft carrier. Decisive weapons.
The story of the kings and queens of England is more surprising than you might think. It's a fine drama, 1,000 years of tales of lust and betrayal, of heroism and cruelty, of mysteries, murders, tragedies and triumphs. And it's also quite unlike the history of other countries' royalty. The thing about the kings and queens of England is that they're totally different from anywhere else, which probably explains why they're still in business when almost everywhere else they've either been given the chop or have stopped being regal. This programme looks at England's monarchs from the death of Queen Anne to the accession of Victoria. Well, Britain's monarchs, actually. And if you look at Europe at the start of this story in 1714, you'll see just what I mean. A European king is an absolute ruler. Louis XIV, Peter the Great, Philip V of Spain, Frederick William of Prussia, all men of unlimited power. It's not like that in Britain. Queen Anne has died. There are no Protestant Stuarts left. The Protestant line to the English throne now passes through James's granddaughter, Sophia, who had married a German prince with the title of Elector of Hanover, and then from her to her son George Louis, who's inherited that antiquated title. Into one quarter of the royal coat of arms pops the amazingly complicated device of a 54-year-old German princeling. And when he comes to England for his coronation, he knows perfectly well that he's not going to be anything like those other rulers. He will be almost powerless. So it really doesn't matter that he can't speak a word of English. At the opening of Parliament, King George stood in silence while his words were read by the Lord Chamberlain. The crown that had belonged to Normans, French Plantagenets, Welsh Tudors and Scottish Stuarts had now passed to the German Hanoverians. The new king's son, George Augustus, arrived from Herrenhausen to take his seat in the House of Lords as Duke of Rothesay, heir to the throne. Before leaving Germany, he proudly declared,
"I had not a drop of blood in my veins which is not English."
Rothesay, of course, is a Scottish dukedom. George Augustus did share one trait with his father's English subjects, a hearty dislike of King George, and for the same reason. 20 years before George became King of England, something very mysterious had happened to his wife's best friend, the dashing Count Königsmark. His wife, Princess Sophia Dorothea, had come to detest her husband, who spent his time either engaged in endless European wars or enjoying his various mistresses. Königsmark tried to help her escape from Hanover. He failed. The Count simply disappeared from the face of the earth. Actually, his body was shoved under the floorboards of the princess's dressing room. And the princess was banished and imprisoned. Her son, George Augustus, never forgave his father. In fact, father-son detestation would be the defining mark of the Hanoverian dynasty. They thrived on it. The English weren't too keen on that sort of behaviour either. They might have been more sympathetic if they'd approved of the two mistresses that George brought with him, but they called them the Maypole and the Elephant, and decided they were simply greedy Germans with their snouts in the trough. And there were Scottish noblemen who thought that with George lacking support in England, this might be an opportunity to hand the throne back to the Stuart family, and in particular to James II's son, living in France and known as the Pretender. The French thought this would be a great idea. Louis XIV's mistress, Madame de Maintenon, even presented him with a song to be sung on his accession. It had originally been written for Louis to celebrate his recovery from a surgical procedure on his bottom. She translated it for the man who should, she thought, be James VIII of Scotland, and, why not, James III of England.
God save a gracious King, long live a noble King, God save the King.
The song turned out to be a bigger hit than the man. The Jacobite Rising of 1715 was a complete flop, and after spending a couple of months wandering around the Highlands, James went home to France. George's throne was safe. He spent every winter in Hanover and left the government of England to his ministers. His own work was done by a new figure, the Prime Minister, a politician acting as a king's substitute. The first man to take on this role was Robert Walpole. Since Walpole didn't speak German, the pair of them communicated in schoolboy Latin. King George died a sudden death in 1727 while in Hanover, aged 67. His son was living in Richmond, forbidden by the old man to take any part in court life or even to see his own children. When Walpole came with the news of his father's death, George II appears to have regarded it as a wind-up. "That is one big lie." But the outcast prince was indeed now George II, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, Elector of Hanover, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg and Duke of Celle. When he'd been convinced, he came here to Leicester Square. At the time it was Leicester House, where he'd been running his own court. And here he was attended by the Archbishop of Canterbury, who formally presented him with his father's will. Royal wills had once been the most powerful documents in the world. When William the Conqueror and Henry II died, their wills established who would rule after them. George took his father's will and, instead of opening it, shoved it in his pocket. It was never seen again, to the great disappointment of his father's mistresses. George II's wife, Queen Caroline, had very firm ideas on what should happen next, and her husband was quite obedient. The result was that everyone who'd been hoping for their own promotion in a changed government was disappointed. Walpole remained Prime Minister. He'd promised her that she would get a personal grant of £100,000 a year, double the offer his opposition came up with, and very little actually changed at all. That included the traditional hostility between anyone called King George and his son. The son in question was now, of course, the son of George II, Prince Frederick. According to Queen Caroline, he was
the greatest ass, the greatest liar, the greatest canaille, and the greatest beast in the whole world, and we heartily wish he was out of it.
She would have said it in German. George agreed with the Queen and refused to allow Frederick to marry Princess Wilhelmina of Prussia on the entirely sensible grounds that
I did not think that engrafting my half-witted coxcomb upon a mad woman would improve the breed.
Prince Frederick's view of his father was by contrast quite balanced and objective. He's an obstinate, self-indulgent, miserly martinet with an insatiable sexual appetite. Obstinate? Yes. Self-indulgent? A fair point. Miserly? Well, he had slashed Frederick's allowance to make him less of a social rival. Martinet? Well, certainly a man of relentless and determined regular routine. And the sexual appetite? We assumed that as his right. For instance, he began seriously lusting after the beautiful young wife of the Count of Volmoden when he met her in Hanover in 1735, and he told the Queen that
You must love the Valmoden, for she loves me.
the popular view of the king was that he was a randy buffoon. He seems to have been flattered by the jokes about his sexual efforts. As his father had once done, Frederick ran his own alternative court, which was far more popular than the king's. King George II didn't like that.
Mein Gott, popularity always makes me sick, but this makes me vomit.
The pair of them even patronized rival operatic outfits. The king and his entourage went to see Handel at the Haymarket. Handel had written George's coronation anthems. His music was grand and glorious, altogether suitable for magnifying the greatness of a self-important royal personage. The prince and his crowd stayed away. They went instead to the Theatre Royal in Lincoln's Inn Fields. That was where opera was being transformed into popular musical theatre. The biggest hit was The Beggar's Opera, a vigorous tale of the criminal classes which lots of people said was intended as a satire on the court and Walpole's government.
When you censure the age, be cautious and sage, lest the courtiers offended should be. If you mention vice or bribe, 'tis so pat to all the tribe, each cries, that was levelled at me.
It was all very entertaining, watching royalty playing out their family quarrels, but they were not quite reduced to the level of powerless performers. King George was a fighting man, like his father, head of the army, and very much engaged in the quarrels between the rulers of continental Europe. Walpole tried hard to keep him out of wars, but in 1739 the king got his way, and England went to war with Spain. This was the start of a steadily growing involvement in the power struggle between France, Prussia, and the Habsburg Empire. Its culmination for George came in June 1743. He found himself under attack by the French at a German village called Dettingen. His horse bolted, but George stood in front of his troops, waved his sword, and made a rather ponderous but actually rather brave little speech.
Now, boys, now for the honor of England. Fire and behave bravely, and the French will soon run.
And so he became the last English king to lead his troops in battle. It was a fierce fight, and George emerged a bit of a hero. But he didn't rule the country. Governments and ministers came and went not because he wanted them, but because Parliament wanted them. In fact, George called himself a prisoner on the throne. In 1745, he played no part in the battles of Prestonpans or Culloden, which were far more important to the throne than the Battle of Dettingen. After all, they were battles for the throne itself. The cause of King James Stuart, the king who'd fled from William of Orange in 1688, had never been forgotten by the Scottish Highlanders. Its supporters of a Roman Catholic monarchy, were called Jacobites, the Latin for James being Jacobus. James's son, the Pretender, had tried and failed to take the throne in 1715, and now, 30 years on, he was known as the Old Pretender. His son Charles, born in Rome, was the Young Pretender. Bonnie Prince Charlie to his supporters, Charles Casimir was 25 years old, pale, thin, romantic and brave. And he decided that George was so unpopular it would be a doddle to take over. He turned up at his own expense in the Hebrides, and summoned the Scottish clans. Most of them responded, but out of a combination of loyalty and desperation rather than conviction. But things went rather well for the rebels. They were enthusiastically welcomed into Edinburgh and roundly defeated the government army at Prestonpans. The news created a passion of patriotism when it reached London. The city might have lampooned the court and sneered at it, but this was different. That evening the king was visiting the theatre, the King's Theatre, Drury Lane, and the orchestra struck up a tune which they'd just got hold of.
God save a gracious King, long live a noble King, God save the King.
The audience loved it. None of them knew that it had been the Old Pretender's music, or the King of France's. The song had changed sides and became the national anthem. Actually, it became everybody's anthem at one time or another. Frenchmen, Germans, Russians, Swiss, Liechtensteiners, Swedes, Danes, and Americans have all swelled with patriotic pride to exactly the same tune. But when God Save the King became London's big hit, it was because no one could see how the king would be saved any other way. Marshal Wade, the best officer in the government army, said that Scotland was lost and England would fall prey to the first comer.
Lord, grant that Marshal Wade may by thy mighty aid victory bring. May he sedition hush, and like a torrent rush, rebellious Scots to crush. God save the King.
The rebels took Manchester, then Derby. London trembled, but not as much as the clansmen. They'd marched expecting England to rise in their support and the French to invade. Instead, they had no support at all. Most fundamentally, they realized that the English would never accept a Roman Catholic king. They'd outflanked a large English army, but it was now on their tail, and another was coming up from London. So back they went, and the clansmen were finally slaughtered in their thousands at Culloden in April 1746. Charles hid out for months in the Scottish Islands, hunted through the mountains by troops and with a price on his head, but protected by tribal loyalties until he finally escaped back to France. And the clan culture of the Highlands was systematically and ruthlessly extirpated. Clans were dispersed, their leaders imprisoned or executed, plaid and weaponry and bagpipes were banned. The would-be Charles III made a bizarre secret return to England in 1750, where he converted to Protestantism and expected this would encourage his supporters to have more hope. They were more impressed by his degree of attachment to the bottle. Not so much the king over the water as the king under the table. King George was in no danger now. George also found his other great enemy removed. His son Frederick died in 1751. He'd been hit hard in the stomach by a tennis ball, and the resulting abdominal ulcer burst and killed him. The new heir to the throne was a 12-year-old child, Frederick's son, George. But the great problems of the kingdom were outside the king's grasp. His country was now a great imperial trading power, with huge involvements in India, the East Indies, North America, and the Mediterranean. So was France. At the same time, continental Europe was constantly boiling over into war, and Hanover was in the middle of that. In 1756, the great powers finally locked horns in a do-or-die struggle that would girdle the whole world. This would become the 7 Years' War. It was truly the First World War. Britain fought in the name of its king, but that king now neither directed policy nor took part in the battles. A new world. In fact, affairs were so far out of the king's control that when he dismissed ministers he didn't like, they came right back again. So far as the English were concerned, this was just how things ought to be. Englishmen were entitled to liberty. The despots were on the other side, Catholic France and Austria. Their whole life, commerce, industry, and fighting force was directed by royal tyrants who ruled over starving and powerless peasants. And on the other side, Protestant Britain, whose commerce was run by men of business, whose industry was directed by free tradesmen, whose army and navy were run by heroes and manned by proud free men, and whose court was the centre of society, not of autocratic power. And that was how many of the British really did see it. Of course, they were also fighting despotic Prussia, but that was a minor detail. The general perception was that this was a war of free Britons against European despots. Poor George died at the height of the war in 1760, and it didn't matter at all. His grandson, now George III, was 22 years old. He had been brought up by his mother, a German princess, in her imitation of the very deferential court of Hanover. He learned the European idea of what a king should be, an enlightened despot whose power was absolute and was to be used for the benefit of mankind. This was, of course, very far from the English notion of kingship, in which the king was the leading figure in society, but whose power was entirely controlled by Parliament. He immediately set to work as a bossy, quick-speaking, managerial king, deliberately fogyish. "I'll have no innovations in my time. What? He read widely. He was fascinated by machinery and agriculture. He was a man delighted by the agricultural and industrial revolutions, and he was determined to restore the crown to what he saw as its proper position, a position abandoned, in his view, by Georges I and II. Unlike them, he'd been born in England, and spoke good English even if his grasp of grammar was ropey, and he had no old or young pretender to challenge him. At the opening of his first Parliament he declared, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." Parliament was controlled by one party, the Whigs, effectively an oligarchy of rich men who ran the country by a system of bribery, patronage, and nepotism. George felt that it was his job to improve matters. And so began the most catastrophic reign since James II. If it hadn't been for George III's attempt to turn back the clock, the inhabitants of New York might still be using British passports, and the inhabitants of Los Angeles and Miami, Spanish ones. Now there's a thought. To break the power of the Whigs, he set about creating what was almost his own political party, a group of MPs known as the King's Friends. He took back the power of distributing positions and favours from the government and did it himself, so he soon built up a collection of political dependents. His first objective was to bring an end to the war. He didn't at all share the anti-French views of the Whig Prime Minister, William Pitt. It took a lot of political manipulation, but in 1763, with Pitt removed from power, a peace treaty was signed. By this stage, the war had actually been won. Pitt's policies had resulted in Britain becoming the dominant colonial power in the world. Britain was more or less undisputed ruler of North America, India, the Caribbean, and much besides. And George took the credit, the glory, and tried to take control. At the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, the King of England ruled over more of the world than any man since Genghis Khan, an empire about 5 times larger than Rome. Of course, he wasn't in the position of an Asiatic tyrant, or even your common or garden European despot. His control would have to be through Parliament. His power was limited to choosing ministers, and even that wouldn't work if Parliament and the country wouldn't stomach him, as George kept finding out. His solution was to do all he could to increase his own influence in Parliament, in effect get stuck right into political intrigues. Since it was illegal to report parliamentary debates, people became very suspicious of what was going on. He spent huge sums on trying to influence elections, and would even personally go out canvassing. On one occasion, for instance, bustling into a draper's shop, saying, "The Queen wants a gown," announcing who to vote for, and rushing out again. And since George was closely engaged in politics, people naturally blamed him personally when things went wrong. When Parliament rejected a bill that would have helped the Spitalfields weavers, the weavers marched off to find the king at Wimbledon. Shades of the Peasants' Revolt. George listened to their complaints and persuaded them to go back home. But when they realized he wasn't going to help, they rioted, and he personally ordered out the troops. He said he would put himself at the head of the army or do anything else to save his country. He also had a hand in creating the notorious Stamp Act of 1765, which tried to make the English colonists in America pay a tax on paper. This was the moment at which the whole language of politics began to change. One Virginia colonist declared, "Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell. May George III profit from their example." The Cromwellian revolution of the previous century had certainly been driven by the connection between taxation and liberty. The issue now was that the 13 English colonies in America had their own governments, run by their own local oligarchies, and raising their own taxes. The idea that they could be taxed by the oligarchy in London, headed by the king, was totally outrageous. They would have no way to influence what was done or what they had to pay. Colonists who supported the government were threatened by their compatriots. Some were tarred and feathered. And by the time the act came into effect, there wasn't a single person who'd accepted the job of commissioner to collect the tax. It had to be repealed. There was similar alarm in England, as in his attempt to control Parliament, George arrested his leading critic there, John Wilkes. Mobs rioted in the name of Wilkes and liberty and threatened the king. Wilkes was released, and it was established that there was a legal right to report and criticize what happened in Parliament. But by 1770, he had created the political system he wanted. The political parties had collapsed, and he had a docile chief minister, Lord North, with a parliamentary majority through whom he could run things the way he thought they should be. George liked running things. Popularly known as Farmer George, he took a very close interest in modern farming methods, developing animal breeds and new crops. These were the same modern farming methods, which by enclosing common lands and creating large self-contained farms, were breaking up village communities all over England and creating a new class of half-starved, landless wage labourers. Bad harvest didn't help, nor did a collapse in trade. The colonists in America were showing their anger by refusing to import anything from Britain. Lord North decided the best thing to do was repeal all the taxes on them except for a symbolic tax on tea. 3 years later, he arranged another Act of Parliament to try to help the East India Company sell more tea in America, and radicals in Boston retaliated with a symbolic tea party, at which men dressed as Native Americans dumped the tea in the harbour. The reaction in England, stirred by the popular press, was that the colonists must be punished. George certainly shared that view. Blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. Misunderstanding the strength of feeling and of organization against them, the government tried to use too little force and triggered a full-scale rebellion. The rebel colonists proclaimed their independence in 1776. And with the backing of a large part of popular opinion in England, George was determined to fight them and crush them. The result, as many less warlike Englishmen had been warning, was disaster for England. Even Lord North wanted out, but George was in charge. The American Revolutionary War became a campaign not against unjust government or English rule, but against the very principle of monarchic government. George's determination to be active in government and place himself at the heart of politics created a new republican movement, a language in which to attack the rule of kings. The Peace of Versailles in 1783 forced Britain to recognize the United States of America. 6 years later, their host at Versailles, Louis XVI of France, was himself called on by a revolutionary crowd who carried him off and set up their own republic. The process of destroying monarchy was underway. Did George understand what he'd done? He certainly fretted about the American disaster, and perhaps it was his own sense of failure that made him display signs of mental disturbance in 1788, talking incessantly and behaving oddly. His doctor thought making him bleed would help. When that failed, the Prince of Wales took over the treatment. The Prince of Wales was 26 years old, a dashing, if rather fat, man about town, and in the grand tradition of their Hanoverian ancestors, King George and his son hated each other. The prince lived in the house bought for his mother, the Duke of Buckingham's magnificent home near St. James's Park. It was still called Buckingham House. He liked it so much he eventually built a rather dull palace round it. When he came of age, he'd set up his home in Clarence House, taken his seat in the House of Lords, and set about being a thorn in Daddy's flesh, partly by opposing his father's ministers, and partly by his wildly extravagant social life, in the course of which he secretly married a glamorous widow, Mrs. Fitzherbert, after a passionate wooing process that included theatrically stabbing himself to safely produce as much blood as possible. The marriage was illegal. He wasn't allowed to wed without the king's consent. It was also significant that the lady was a Roman Catholic. In 1780, anti-Catholic rioters stirred up by Lord George Gordon had taken over London for a week. Eventually dispersed by troops on the king's orders, the Gordon riots ended with 290 people dead and 25 ringleaders hanged, not, of course, Lord George. Prinny, as his friends called him, spent his time in gambling clubs, in the company of dandies like Beau Brummel, and put much energy into building the bizarre and spectacular pavilion in Brighton. That's where he was when he heard that the king was mentally ill, and he hurried off to Windsor to take over. 28 years old, he was going to be regent. When the king saw his son, he physically attacked him. He threw Prinny against a wall. The poor boy burst into tears. There was then a huge political battle over what powers the regent would be allowed to have. His own bunch of politicians, led by Fox on one side, and the king's, led by Pitt, on the other. Fox's supporters saw Pitt as a sort of fungus with as many arms as an octopus, growing on and taking over the royal dunghill. And the Prince of Wales brought in his own physician to treat the king or torture him. The royal physicians blistered the king's forehead to draw the poison out of his brain, forced him to take useless drugs, ordering servants to sit on the king when he resisted, and refused to let him have a fire in his room during the terribly cold winter. All this when the country was anticipating French invasion and radical revolution, and volunteer regiments were being formed as a desperate line of defence. Very desperate. Finally, new physicians were brought in who gave the king gentler treatment, and he recovered. In 1801, before the arguments over how the regency would function had been resolved, the king was back in charge. But not in the way he had been. The American defeat had been a personal disaster for him and dramatically weakened his political position. In an effort to reassert it, he'd installed a 24-year-old as Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer, thinking that here at least was a politician he could control. But William Pitt's son, Pitt the Younger, was shrewd, capable, and fully understood that George depended on him, so he held all the cards. And it was Pitt who had to decide how to deal with the spread of revolutionary republican ideas from America and France into England. The same ideas that had been voiced in America about no taxation without representation were being heard in England, where huge new manufacturing towns had grown up, which had no member of Parliament. 3 years after the French Revolution, political reform societies called corresponding societies were founded in England. Riots were breaking out in the Midlands, in East Anglia, in Scotland. Attempts were made to kill the king. He was booed and stoned in London. And the French legislature passed a fraternal decree offering aid to all peoples seeking to throw off the chains of tyranny.